Today we are going to discuss the role and function of the rehabilitation counselor. Obviously, this is something that throughout other lectures and throughout your other readings and other sections of this class, you certainly have had exposure and have gleaned what the role and function of the rehabilitation counselor is. Obviously, for those of you who are employed and working as rehabilitation counselors, you know what those roles and functions are, or at least you know the ones that you do. And I think it's important to emphasize that there are many ways in which we as rehabilitation counselors function. Some of us function as evaluators primarily. Some of us function as case managers primarily. Others of us do job placement. Others of us may have more administrative roles. Others may have specific types of caseloads, working with individuals with certain types of impairments, disabilities, and so there may not be a lot of people or many people who do all of the multiple roles that rehabilitation professionals do. Some of the basic areas in which we function as rehabilitation professionals have to do with case finding. And I don't mean case finding in a way that we're doing marketing as a private business might market. What we're doing in case finding is working with potential referral sources to let those referral sources know what it is that we do and who would typically be eligible for our services. And it would be working with different, it could be hospitals, it could be educational institutions, it could be private clinics. We would go out and we would describe and we would discuss our services. In private rehabilitation practice, people do case finding also. There's probably a little bit more in the line of what you might do if you were doing marketing. But in my way of thinking, it can be, again, letting people know what it is that you do, how you do what you do, and what the expected outcomes would be. And I think it's important that we do case finding, particularly in public rehabilitation, that we do case finding in order to be able to let people know the types of things that we're engaged in. A second area that we're involved in is doing intakes. When we do intakes, what we're doing is collecting information about the individual. We're gathering information. We're trying to determine the abilities of the person. This is the part where we would do an intake worksheet where we would collect information about the person's background, education, age, work experience, the nature of the impairment, the nature of how that impairment affects the person, and as well as any sources in which the person might have information that would be helpful. We would also then not so much diagnose, but we would go out and we would have the person go for other evaluations, other types of information. We would take that information and we would then help the person to determine what types of services would be the most appropriate, develop after we determine eligibility of the person, assuming the person is eligible, we would establish vocational and independent living goals. We would establish a way in which the person would meet those goals, services needed, whether those are educational services or work adjustment or personal adjustment services, vocational training, educational remedial services, and so forth. We would provide those services, and then we would work with the person in terms of placing the person into employment, or assisting placing the person into employment. With regard to some of these issues in a little different way, we look at identification of consumers, information collection, eligibility determination, rehabilitation planning, goal determination, plan implementation. Now, we will be discussing these in more detail in the case management class when we get into these areas in more detail. But these will be some of the things in which we apply our roles and our functions, and because you can break down those roles and functions, and in the past many individuals have studied the roles and functions of rehabilitation professionals and have come up with numerous studies which you can read about. But I think the important thing is the general knowledge of the general roles and functions, and how they would interface with the rehabilitation process. I believe that also that in private rehabilitation you'll find some roles and functions that are a little bit different depending upon what we're asked to do. Sometimes in private rehabilitation we're asked to do things such as do labor market surveys, determine jobs that might be available for an individual. We might also look at just whether the person is employable or not. In many cases, the question in private rehabilitation practice is, are there jobs that this person can do or not, whether they want to do those jobs or not. And one of the differences, and we're going to be talking about this in a different lecture, one of the differences between public and private rehabilitation is that in public rehabilitation, there's much more of an emphasis on choice, that the person chooses or selects services based upon not just abilities but on interests. But in private rehabilitation, the question is not so much do you want to do a particular job, it's can you do a particular job. And so the question is a little bit different. And what we're asked to do in private rehabilitation typically is a little bit different. And we're going to get to that in the when we talk about the private sector area, some of those differences, and some of those differences are based upon not on the philosophy. In private rehabilitation, the philosophy being that you're certainly eligible for benefits if you are injured. However, that eligibility would in part be modified by the fact that you can't always just do what you want to do in terms of work. If there are jobs that are available for you, you don't really have as much of a choice in doing those jobs or in going into a different career area because of the nature of the funding stream, which is in private rehabilitation based more on a private sector insurance model rather than in public rehabilitation based more on more global allocations of general tax monies. But in any event, I think it's important for us to recognize that our roles and functions, while they may differ in public and private sector rehabilitation, also have to be founded on ethical practice and ethical principles. Tasks of rehabilitation counselors include formulating plans and service goals, IPEs, interviewing consumers to obtain background information, participating in consumer staffings, and I believe strongly that it's important for us to work very closely with with our constituent groups and with also other professionals as part of the rehabilitation process, that we don't work in isolation, that for a rehabilitation plan to be successful, I believe that it's important that we have the support of others who would have a significant part in this, other significant others, such as family members, support system members. I think they are part of the consumer's network of individuals, and I have seen that in some cases the best work that we can do can be undone by a support system member who undermines or sabotages the types of services and the types of plans that we have developed. So I think it's important for us to work very closely with consumers and their significant others and support systems and networks. It's also important for us to work with other professionals, and I think that we have an important role to play in a consumer's future, and we bring expertise in terms of adjustment in vocational matters. Other professionals, whether those are other professionals who have similar backgrounds, other colleagues, or whether they are other professionals from other disciplines, also have perspectives. And I think in terms of being able to fully help an individual, it's important for us to work and collaborate and cooperate with other professionals, because they would be also a part of a rehabilitation team. And of course that would vary depending upon the person. It could be physicians, it could be psychologists, psychiatrists, it could be physical therapists, it could be nurses, social workers, teachers, any number of other individuals who have knowledge and a perspective on the consumer. And taking into consideration those other individuals and their perspectives, and helping the consumer to ingest and understand what the other professionals are saying and what they're recommending, is important, not only for us to avoid conflicts in terms of directions that the consumer is going, but also to make sure that we have covered everything that needs to be covered. Because what I've also found or seen is that everybody has their own perspective on and their own viewpoint of the world, and frequently that viewpoint is shaped by the professional identity of the individual and the perspective and the background that person comes from. And so it's important for us to not only understand that perspective, but also to see if there's something in that we need to pick up on in order to benefit the consumer. I like to feel that as rehabilitation professionals, we're the ones in the seat of seeing the total picture, that we have the whole broad perspective in mind, because we're the ones who are going to take the person through a process that's going to cover a lot of territory in terms of assisting the consumer, whereas others have also very important roles, but not as broad and all-encompassing as we do. Now that may be a little grandiose, but I think as you practice, you will see that when helping the consumer, we're the ones that really move the person forward and through a process. So you might have physical therapists who help with that sort of therapy, physical or occupational therapy. You might have social workers who handle discrete types of issues with the person. You might have physicians who prescribe medication or do a medical procedure. But we are the profession that moves the person along a process going from where they're at into employment, which is a big all-encompassing approach to assisting the individual. Okay, so we participate in staffings. That's where I was kind of left off on this. As I was saying before, we identify agencies and resources. We ensure continuity of services to consumers, and through all of this, we do counseling. The knowledge required for rehabilitation counselors to be effective includes medical information, and related to that would be information on adaptive and assistive technology, medication, medical and psychological aspects of disability, theories of personality and resulting counseling theories, and ways in which we can help people with behavior change. And we have to understand different human service systems, as well as understand community resources. And we have to have a good grounding in legal and ethical issues related to rehabilitation counseling practice. Sometimes you might have questions about conflicts between what our agency requires us to do and our ethical standards. Not all the time, but sometimes these will arise, and when they do, it's important that we have procedures to work out those types of problems. And then finally, we have to understand the effects of the cultural, social, economic factors on the rehabilitation process. And that's why I think it's important to understand the consumer and where the consumer is coming from. And that comes about through our understanding the consumer, listening to the consumer, and it comes about by developing rapport with the consumer, empathetic understanding, positive regard, viewing the person as a co-equal, a partner, and working in collaboration with the consumer, as I said, as well as other professionals and the consumer's support system.